Here is something that the standard history of civilization does not want to admit. Every framework we use to measure human progress, from textbooks to documentaries to museum exhibits, is built on the assumption that agriculture was inevitable. That once humans discovered farming, adoption was only a matter of time. That hunter-gatherers were simply waiting to be civilized. The Jomon of Japan spent 15,000 years proving that assumption wrong. They were not primitive. They were not isolated in ignorance. They knew the land around them with the precision of people who had studied it for generations. And they looked at the option of farming, an option that was becoming available across the continent around them, and they made a different calculation. The ancient DNA extracted from their remains has now confirmed what the archaeological record was already suggesting. This was not an accident of geography. It was an adaptive strategy. And it worked for longer than any agricultural civilization in human history has lasted. Let that land for a moment. 15,000 years. The entire span of recorded human history, from the first Sumerian city-states to today, is roughly 5,000 years. The Jomon did not just survive. They built settlements, developed culture, invented technology, and sustained a population across the Japanese archipelago for 3 times the length of everything we call history. Without a single field of cultivated grain, to understand why they made this choice, you have to understand what Japan was offering them. The Japanese archipelago in 14,000 BC was not a place of scarcity. It was the opposite. The forests of Honshu, Kyushu, and Shikoku were dense with deer, wild boar, and bear. The rivers ran with salmon and trout in quantities that modern fishermen cannot imagine. The coastline, one of the longest and most irregular in the world, provided shellfish, sea bream, tuna, and marine mammals in seasonal abundance. The forests offered chestnuts, acorns, walnuts, and wild berries. The sea provided seaweed, sea urchins, and clams. The Jomon were not surviving on the margins of an environment. They were thriving at the center of one of the most productive natural food systems on the planet. Isotopic analysis of their bones, the same technique that tells us what ancient populations ate by analyzing chemical signatures in skeletal tissue, shows a diet of extraordinary diversity and nutritional quality. They were taller on average than the agricultural populations that would later arrive. Their teeth show less decay. Their skeletons show less evidence of the nutritional stress and repetitive strain injuries that plague farming populations. When you understand this, the Jomon choice stops being a mystery. It becomes obvious. Why would you spend your days breaking soil, planting seeds, managing irrigation, storing grain, and defending territory from competing farmers when the forest and the sea were providing everything you needed with a fraction of the effort? This is not a question with a comfortable answer for people who were taught that farming was humanity's great leap forward. Here is the fact that consistently stops people who have not encountered the Jomon before. Around 16,000 years ago, at roughly the same time that the last ice age was ending and humans across the world were still living exclusively as nomadic hunter-gatherers, the Jomon began making pottery. Not simple pottery. Pottery with cord-marked decoration, the technique that gives the Jomon their name, which translates roughly as cord pattern produced with a sophistication that implies generations of accumulated craft knowledge. The oldest confirmed pottery in human history comes from Japan. Not from the Fertile Crescent, where farming began, not from China, where rice cultivation developed, from the Jomon, who were still hunting and fishing when they invented it. This is important because pottery, in the standard model of human progress, is supposed to follow agriculture. You need pottery to store grain. You need grain storage to support sedentary communities. You need sedentary communities to develop the division of labor that produces specialists, including potters. The Jomon broke every link in that chain. They were sedentary without grain. They had pottery without farming. They had settlements without cities. They were, in the technical vocabulary of anthropology, a complex hunter-gatherer society. And they demonstrate something that the standard narrative of progress refuses to accommodate, that sedentary civilization and agriculture are not the same thing. You can have one without the other. The Jomon did it for 15,000 years. Now, here is where the story gets uncomfortable, because the Jomon did eventually encounter agriculture. And what happened to them is not a story of peaceful adoption and cultural exchange. It is a story of displacement, absorption, and demographic replacement that the ancient DNA has now quantified with uncomfortable precision. Around 900 BC, a people archaeologists called the Yayoi began arriving in the Japanese archipelago from continental Asia, most likely from the Korean peninsula and the coastal regions of what is now eastern China. They brought wet rice agriculture. They brought bronze and then iron metallurgy. They brought a mode of food production that could support population densities that the Jomon's hunter-gatherer economy could not match. This is the critical mechanism that the history books understate. Agriculture does not win because it produces better outcomes for the people practicing it. Agriculture wins because it produces more people per square kilometer. A farming community of 1,000 can outpopulate a hunter-gatherer community of 200 within a few generations. When agricultural populations expand, they do not necessarily conquer the people they displace. They simply grow faster, occupy more land, and leave less territory for the communities that lived there before. The Jomon did not lose a war. They lost a demographic competition. And the ancient DNA records exactly how that competition played out. In the past decade, genomic studies of ancient Jomon remains extracted from sites across Japan, from the shell midden deposits where the Jomon discarded their shellfish meals to burial sites on the northern island of Hokkaido have produced a clear picture of what happened genetically when the Yayoi arrived. The mainland Japanese population today carries approximately 10 to 15% Jomon ancestry. The remaining 85 to 90% comes from the Yayoi and the subsequent waves of continental migration that followed. In genetic terms, the Jomon were almost entirely replaced on the main islands of Japan within roughly 1,000 years of the Yayoi's arrival. 1,000 years sounds like a long time. It is not. It is 40 generations. 40 generations to go from a population that had occupied the archipelago for 15,000 years to near complete genetic replacement. But here is what the DNA also shows, and this is the part that the standard account of Japanese origins tends to minimize. The Jomon did not disappear. They were absorbed. They contributed to the genetic makeup of every person alive in Japan today. And in the north, on Hokkaido and the Kuro Islands, one community retained a Jomon genetic signature dramatically higher than the mainland population, the Ainu. The indigenous people of northern Japan, officially recognized by the Japanese government only in 2019, carry approximately 60 to 70% Jomon ancestry. Their DNA connects them directly to the people who first settled the Japanese archipelago at the end of the last ice age. Their language is a linguistic isolate, unrelated to Japanese, unrelated to any language family known to exist, which means it may be a direct descendant of the language the Jomon spoke 15,000 years ago. The Ainu are not a curiosity of ethnography. They are the living archive of a civilization that chose a different path. Now, I want to make an argument that some people will reject immediately. I think it deserves to be stated directly. The history of the Jomon is consistently framed as a story of a primitive people who were eventually surpassed by a more advanced agricultural civilization. The Yayoi brought progress. The Jomon were replaced because they were operating on an inferior system. This is the implicit narrative in almost every account of Japanese prehistory, and it is worth examining what that narrative is actually based on. The Jomon practiced a subsistence strategy that sustained their population for 15,000 years with minimal environmental degradation, high nutritional quality, and based on the skeletal evidence, lower rates of violence than the agricultural populations that followed. The Yayoi brought rice cultivation, which increased population density, but also brought the diseases that travel with dense agricultural communities, the soil depletion that follows intensive farming, and the social stratification that emerges when some people control the land and others work it. I am not arguing that agriculture was a mistake. Agriculture made cities possible, and cities made writing, science, and accumulated knowledge possible. The world we live in is an agricultural world, and it could not exist otherwise. What I am arguing is that the Jomon's choice was rational, adaptive, and successful by every metric that matters for the people living it: health, nutrition, sustainability, and duration. The civilization that replaced them has existed for roughly 3,000 years. The Jomon lasted 5 times longer. If we are going to call one of those systems more advanced than the other, we should at least be honest about which definition of advanced we are using. The ancient DNA has done something that centuries of archaeology could not. It has connected the Jomon to the present in a way that is biologically measurable and personally meaningful. Every person of Japanese ancestry alive today carries Jomon DNA. The proportion varies. It is higher in populations from Okinawa and Hokkaido, lower in the populations of the central and western main islands, but it is present everywhere. The people who invented pottery before anyone else on Earth, who built sedentary settlements without fields, who watched the sea and the forest with the attention of 15,000 years of accumulated knowledge, left a biological inheritance that flows through more than 125 million people today. And through the Ainu, whose recognition as an indigenous people came embarrassingly late in Japanese legal history, the Jomon connection is not just statistical, it is cultural. The Ainu bear ceremony, the Ainu relationship with the forest ecosystem, the Ainu oral traditions that describe a world in which humans and animals exist in a relationship of mutual obligation, these are not curiosities. They are the surviving expression of a civilization that made a different choice than the one history decided to celebrate. So let me close with the question that this evidence forces into the open. We have been taught to read human history as a story of progress, from hunting to farming, from villages to cities, from bronze to iron to silicon. In that story, the Jomon are a footnote, a pre-agricultural people who were eventually surpassed, a curiosity. But the DNA does not read history that way. The DNA reads 15,000 years of continuous occupation, cultural development, and biological success. It reads a people who looked at their environment, understood what it was offering, and built a civilization precisely calibrated to that environment. It reads a genetic inheritance that survived the demographic replacement of the Yayoi, and is still present in over 125 million people today. The Jomon did not fail. They made a choice. And that choice outlasted every civilization that chose differently. Tell me in the comments, do you think the adoption of agriculture was genuinely progress, or just a different trade-off that history decided to call advancement because it was the trade-off that won? Because the Jomon's 15,000 years suggests the answer is more complicated than we were taught,